Imagine being 13 years old and feeling completely alone. Imagine trying to tell the most painful truth about something that is happening to you, only to be told you are lying. What would you do if the people who were supposed to protect you, the adults, the authorities, refused to believe you? This is not a story about imagination. It is a story about reality. It is the story of Taylor Cadle, a brave girl who faced this very nightmare and fought to make her voice heard. Taylor's life changed forever when she was adopted. Like many children in her situation, she hoped for a better life, a family to care for her, a home where she would feel safe. Instead, she entered a world that no child should ever experience. Her adoptive father, Taylor Cadle, was a man the community respected. He was seen as a responsible and caring figure, someone who could be trusted. But behind the walls of their home, Taylor discovered a very different truth. What she endured in silence was something no child should ever have to face. At just 13 years old, Taylor did what most people twice her age would struggle to do. She spoke up. She went to the authorities and told them what was happening. She described in detail the abuse she had been enduring. But instead of offering her protection, they questioned her. Instead of believing her, they accused her of lying. The system, the very one meant to protect children like Taylor, turned its back on her. It was a betrayal that left her even more vulnerable and more isolated. Taylor's cries for help were dismissed, and the authorities went further. They charged her with filing a false report, labeling her as a liar rather than a victim. Imagine being 13 and being told by adults that your truth does not matter. Imagine knowing that the person who hurt you is still free to harm you again, while the people who could have stopped it simply chose not to believe you. This is where Taylor found herself, trapped in a world where no one would listen and no one would help. But Taylor refused to give up. Even as the system failed her, even as she faced doubt from those around her, she knew she had to do something. She knew that the truth mattered, even if no one else was willing to see it. And so, she made a decision that would change everything. She would find a way to prove what had happened to her. She would gather the evidence no one else had bothered to look for. It was a choice that required unimaginable bravery and strength, especially for someone so young. This is a story about failure, the failure of a system that is supposed to protect children. But more importantly, this is a story about courage. It is about how one young girl, in the face of disbelief and rejection, found the strength to fight for justice. Taylor Cadle's story is one that demands to be told. It is a story that forces us to confront the ways in which we fail to listen, to believe, and to protect. Most of all, it is a story of hope, because Taylor's courage reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is a way forward. Taylor Cadle's story begins in a place where many children dream of finding a new start: adoption. Taylor had spent her early years without the stability and security that every child deserves. She hoped that being adopted would give her a chance to experience the love and care she had always longed for. Her adoptive family appeared to offer just that: a home, a fresh start, and a promise of safety. But what should have been the start of a new chapter quickly turned into something far different. Taylor's adoptive father, Taylor Cadle, was a man who others in the community trusted. He was seen as reliable and respectable, the kind of person who could provide a stable environment for a child. To outsiders, the Cadle home appeared to be a normal, loving household. But for Taylor, the reality was much darker. Henry began abusing Taylor at a young age, manipulating her and creating a sense of fear and confusion that no child should ever have to experience. Taylor didn't know how to make sense of what was happening to her. At first, she didn't have the words to describe it. She felt scared, ashamed, and completely alone. Over time, as the abuse continued, Taylor knew she had to tell someone. She needed help. She wanted it to stop. Gathering all the courage she had, Taylor reached out to the adults around her. She told them what Henry was doing. She trusted that someone would listen, that someone would believe her. But instead of being met with support, Taylor was dismissed. The people she confided in didn't take her seriously. They doubted her story and questioned her intentions. Some even suggested that she might be exaggerating or misunderstanding what was happening. Taylor couldn't believe it. She had done everything she thought she was supposed to do. She had spoken out. She had told the truth. Yet no one was willing to help her. When Taylor went to the authorities, hoping they would take action, she faced even greater disbelief. Investigators questioned her credibility and treated her as if she were lying. The case was closed before it even began. And then, to make matters worse, they charged her with filing a false report. Taylor was just 13 years old, and she was being treated as though she were the one at fault. The pain of the abuse was compounded by the pain of being silenced and punished for telling the truth. Imagine what that must have felt like for Taylor, to wake up every day in the same house as her abuser, knowing that the people who were supposed to protect her had chosen to look the other way, to feel the crushing weight of disbelief, knowing that no one would fight for her. For a young girl, this kind of isolation can feel unbearable. But Taylor didn't let it break her. Even as she faced rejection after rejection, she held on to the truth she knew in her heart. She knew what had happened to her, and she refused to let anyone tell her otherwise. Living in that environment took an enormous toll on Taylor. She felt trapped, like there was no way out. The emotional strain was overwhelming. Every time she tried to stand up for herself, she was knocked back down by a system that refused to believe her. She began to question whether there was anyone she could trust. The walls of her world seemed to close in, leaving her with nothing but fear and frustration. But even in those moments of despair, Taylor found a spark of determination. She realized that if no one else would help her, she would have to help herself. The psychological impact of being dismissed was profound. Taylor felt invisible, like her pain didn't matter. She began to see how easy it was for people to turn a blind eye, to ignore the truth when it was inconvenient. But Taylor also began to see her own strength. She realized that she couldn't rely on others to fight this battle for her. If she wanted justice, she would have to find a way to prove her story on her own. This was the environment Taylor lived in, one where her voice was silenced, her truth was doubted, and her courage was constantly tested. But it was also the environment that shaped her into the fighter she would become. Taylor's story is not just about the pain she endured. It is about the strength she discovered in the face of unimaginable challenges. It is about how one young girl refused to give up, even when the world refused to believe her. Taylor Cadle was just a child when she first tried to speak up about what was happening to her. She didn't have the words to fully explain the pain she was experiencing, but she knew it was wrong. She wanted someone to stop it. She wanted to feel safe. With all the courage she could gather, she told the adults in her life what was happening. She shared her story, hoping that they would listen and protect her. But what she faced instead was disbelief. The authorities who were supposed to help her didn't see her as a victim. They saw her as a problem. When Taylor reported the abuse, they didn't take her words seriously. They looked at her, a 13-year-old girl, and decided her story didn't matter. They accused her of making it up. Instead of asking how they could protect her, they accused her of lying. And just like that, Taylor found herself completely alone, her words dismissed, her truth ignored. Her adoptive father, Henry Cadle, played his part perfectly. He knew how to appear trustworthy and responsible. To the outside world, he was a kind, caring man who had taken Taylor into his home out of love and generosity. He had the respect of the community, and he used that respect to hide what he was doing. When Taylor spoke up, he denied everything, twisting the narrative to make her look like the one who couldn't be trusted. He told people she was lying, that she was troubled, and that she was just trying to get attention. The adults around Taylor seemed to believe him. They saw him as someone who couldn't possibly be capable of such terrible things. Taylor, on the other hand, was just a child. They assumed she must be confused or exaggerating. They couldn't or wouldn't imagine that she might be telling the truth. This kind of bias, where children are not believed simply because of their age, is one of the reasons so many abuse survivors stay silent. For Taylor, it meant that no one stepped in to help her when she needed it most. The power imbalance between Taylor and her adoptive father was enormous. He controlled every aspect of her life. He was the authority figure in the home, and he knew how to use that power to keep her quiet. Taylor lived with the constant fear that no one would believe her. Every time she tried to speak up, she was reminded of how powerless she really was. And each time she was dismissed, the abuse continued, unchecked and unnoticed by the world around her. For Taylor, the rejection from the authorities was devastating. She had done everything she could to protect herself. She had spoken out, she had told the truth. And yet, instead of being believed, she was punished. The authorities charged her with filing a false report, treating her as if she were the problem instead of the victim. This added another layer of pain to an already unbearable situation. Not only was she dealing with the trauma of the abuse, but now she was also facing the consequences of being labeled a liar. Taylor was just a child, but she understood exactly what was happening. She knew that the system had failed her. She knew that the adults who were supposed to protect her had chosen to look the other way. The pain of being disbelieved was almost as bad as the abuse itself. It made her feel invisible, like her voice didn't matter, like her truth wasn't important. For someone so young, that kind of rejection can feel overwhelming. But Taylor didn't let it break her. The disbelief Taylor faced wasn't just about the people in her immediate life. It was part of a larger problem. Society often struggles to believe children when they speak out about abuse. There is a tendency to doubt their words, to question their motives, and to assume that they don't fully understand what they're saying. This kind of bias creates a culture where survivors are afraid to come forward, where abusers are allowed to continue their actions without consequence. Taylor's story is a painful example of how this bias can destroy trust and leave survivors feeling hopeless. Despite all of this, Taylor refused to give up. She knew the truth. She knew what had happened to her. And she knew that if no one else would fight for her, she would have to fight for herself. Taylor's courage in the face of disbelief is a testament to her strength and resilience. Even when the world around her turned its back, she held on to her truth. She knew that her voice mattered, even if no one else could see it yet. Taylor Cadle reached a point where she understood that no one was coming to help her. She had tried everything, telling her story, reporting to the authorities, and asking for protection, but all her efforts had been dismissed. At just 13 years old, she realized that if she wanted justice, she would have to take matters into her own hands. It was not a decision any child should have to make, but Taylor saw no other way. She decided she would gather the evidence herself. Taylor didn't have access to fancy tools or professional guidance. She didn't have anyone to help her or show her how to document what was happening. What she did have was determination and the understanding that this was her last chance to make people believe her. She needed proof that could not be ignored, something clear and undeniable. Taylor's plan began to take shape, and she decided to use a small device, a camera, to capture the truth. Taking those photos was one of the riskiest decisions Taylor ever made. She knew that if her abuser discovered what she was doing, the consequences could be severe. She knew that gathering this evidence meant putting herself in even greater danger. But Taylor also knew she had no other choice. The people who should have protected her had turned their backs, and the only way to make them see the truth was to show them what was happening. One day, during another moment of abuse, Taylor made her move. She carefully positioned the camera, making sure it would capture what was happening without being noticed. Her hands trembled as she set everything up, her heart racing with fear. But Taylor didn't let her fear stop her. She pressed the button and took the photos that would later change everything. In those moments, Taylor was risking everything she had, but she knew that these photos were the only way to prove her story. The images Taylor captured were clear and undeniable. They showed the abuse she had been enduring, and for the first time, Taylor had the proof she needed. She had gathered evidence that could not be explained away or ignored. When she looked at the photos, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because she knew the truth was now out in the open, and sadness because it had come to this, because she had been forced to take such drastic measures to be believed. Taylor didn't stop there. She made sure to keep the photos safe, knowing that they were her only chance to make the authorities act. She had to be cautious, hiding the camera and the evidence from her abuser. Every day she lived with the fear that he might find out what she had done, but despite the constant danger, Taylor never wavered. She knew that what she had done was necessary, and she was willing to face the risks if it meant ending the abuse. Finally, Taylor took the evidence to the authorities. This time, she walked into the room not just with her words, but with solid proof. She handed over the photos, her heart pounding as she waited for their reaction. The authorities looked at the images, and for the first time, they couldn't dismiss her story. The evidence was clear. The truth was right in front of them. Taylor had forced them to see what they had ignored for so long. This moment was a turning point in Taylor's fight for justice. The photos she had risked so much to capture became the foundation of the case against her abuser. They were undeniable proof of what she had been enduring, and they forced the system to finally take action. Taylor's bravery had paid off, but it had come at a great cost. She had been forced to put herself in harm's way to get the help she deserved. While the evidence gave her a path to justice, it also served as a reminder of how deeply the system had failed her. The risks Taylor took to gather that evidence cannot be overstated. She was just a child, yet she displayed a level of courage and determination that few adults could muster. Every moment she spent documenting the abuse was a moment of danger, a moment when her life could have taken an even darker turn. But Taylor knew that the only way to protect herself and others was to make the truth impossible to ignore. And that is exactly what she did. The photos Taylor took were not just evidence of the abuse. They were a testament to her strength and her refusal to be silenced. They showed the world what she had been through and forced everyone to finally see the truth. It was a moment of both triumph and heartbreak, as Taylor's bravery revealed not only the depth of the abuse she had suffered, but also the failure of the system to protect her when she needed it most. When Taylor handed over the evidence she had gathered, it was impossible for the authorities to ignore her any longer. The photos she had taken spoke louder than any words ever could. For the first time, the people who had doubted her, dismissed her, and accused her of lying were forced to face the truth. With undeniable proof in their hands, the authorities had no choice but to act. Taylor's abuser, Henry Cadle, was arrested, and a criminal case was opened against him. The arrest marked a turning point in Taylor's fight for justice, but it was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The legal process that followed was anything but easy. The trial itself became a battle not just for Taylor's truth, but for her dignity and her voice. For weeks, she had to relive the trauma she had endured, recounting every painful detail in front of strangers, lawyers, and a jury. From the very start, the prosecution built their case around the evidence Taylor had so courageously gathered. The photos were central to the trial. They showed exactly what Taylor had been describing all along. The prosecution argued that this evidence, combined with Taylor's testimony, was proof beyond any doubt of what Henry Cadle had done. They emphasized Taylor's bravery, pointing out that she had been forced to do what the system had failed to do: protect herself. But the defense didn't make things easy. They tried to tear Taylor's story apart. They questioned the authenticity of the photos, suggesting that they might have been manipulated or staged. They tried to paint Taylor as a troubled child, someone who was seeking attention or acting out. It was a cruel and relentless attack, designed to make the jury question her credibility. For Taylor, sitting in that courtroom and hearing those accusations was deeply painful. She had already been dismissed so many times, and now, even with undeniable evidence, she was being made to feel like she was the one on trial. Despite the defense's efforts, Taylor didn't back down. When it was her turn to testify, she spoke with clarity and strength. She told the court exactly what had happened to her, answering every question with honesty and composure. Her words were raw and real, painting a vivid picture of the abuse she had endured. The courtroom was silent as Taylor spoke, every person there listening to her story, finally hearing the truth that had been ignored for so long. The prosecution also called on experts to strengthen their case. Forensic analysts confirmed that the photos were genuine and had not been altered in any way. Counselors who had worked with Taylor testified about the trauma she had experienced and how it aligned with the behaviors of someone who had been abused. These testimonies further solidified the case against Henry Cadle, leaving little room for doubt. The defense tried to counter these points, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury could see through the attempts to discredit Taylor. They could see her courage, her resilience, and her unwavering determination to make her voice heard. They could see the truth that Taylor had fought so hard to bring to light. As the trial went on, the emotional toll on Taylor and her family became clear. Each day in court brought new challenges, forcing Taylor to confront the man who had caused her so much pain. For her family, it was heartbreaking to watch her go through this process, knowing how much she had already endured. But through it all, Taylor remained strong. She knew that this was her chance to finally achieve justice, and she wasn't going to let anything stop her. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and evidence, the trial came to a close. The jury began their deliberations, and for Taylor, the waiting was excruciating. She had done everything she could. She had told her story, provided her evidence, and stood strong in the face of countless challenges. Now, all she could do was wait and hope that the jury would see the truth. When the verdict was finally announced, it was a moment of relief and validation for Taylor. The jury found Henry Cadle guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 17 years in prison, ensuring that he would never be able to harm another child again. For Taylor, it was the justice she had fought so hard to achieve. It was the moment when her voice was finally heard, and her truth was finally acknowledged. But the trial was not just a victory for Taylor. It was a powerful message to everyone who had doubted her, dismissed her, or tried to silence her. It was a reminder of the strength and resilience of survivors, and of the importance of listening to their stories. Taylor's fight for justice had been long and painful, but in the end, she had triumphed. Her courage had brought the truth to light and had ensured that her abuser could never hurt anyone else. The impact of the trial went beyond the courtroom. It forced people to take a hard look at how survivors of abuse are treated, how often their voices are ignored, and how easily their stories are dismissed. Taylor's case became a symbol of the need for change, a call to action for a system that had failed her so many times before. Her bravery inspired others to speak out, to fight for justice, and to believe that their voices mattered. In the end, Taylor's fight was about more than just her own story. It was about ensuring that no other child would have to face what she had faced. It was about showing the world that the truth cannot be silenced, no matter how hard people try to ignore it. Taylor's courage changed everything. and her story will continue to inspire others for years to come. After the trial of Henry Cadle, Taylor Cadle's fight for justice seemed complete. Her abuser was found guilty and sentenced to prison, a victory that validated all her bravery and determination. But there was still one issue hanging over Taylor's life: the false charge of filing a false report against her. This charge, made when Taylor was just 13 years old, had been a painful stain on her fight for justice. It was a reminder of how deeply the system had failed her from the very beginning. When Taylor first reported her abuse, she expected to be protected. She believed that the authorities would step in, investigate, and remove her from danger. Instead, her words were dismissed, and she was accused of lying. To make matters worse, she was criminalized for speaking up. The false charge of filing a false report sent a chilling message: that her pain didn't matter, that her truth wasn't worth believing. It left her feeling powerless, silenced, and betrayed. Even after her abuser's conviction, this charge continued to weigh on Taylor's life. It was a mark of injustice that had never been addressed. For Taylor, it was a painful reminder of how the system had turned its back on her when she needed it most. It wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about holding the system accountable for its failures. Taylor's legal team worked tirelessly to have the charge overturned. They argued that the charge was based on an investigation that had been incomplete and biased. They pointed out that the same authorities who had accused her of lying were the ones who had later used her evidence to convict her abuser. This contradiction revealed the flaws in how her case was handled. The charge of filing a false report was not only unjust but also a reflection of a system that had failed to protect a child. As the process unfolded, it became clear that overturning this charge wasn't just about Taylor. It was about exposing the larger systemic issues that allowed such an injustice to happen in the first place. The people involved in the original investigation were forced to confront their mistakes. They had dismissed Taylor without a thorough investigation, relying on assumptions instead of evidence. They had allowed their biases to cloud their judgment, and in doing so, they had caused a young girl even more harm. The legal team presented their case, showing how Taylor's courage and evidence had ultimately proven her story to be true. They argued that the charge of filing a false report should never have been made in the first place. It wasn't just an error, it was a failure of the system to believe and support a vulnerable child. The evidence that Taylor had gathered, at great personal risk, was the same evidence that later led to her abuser's conviction. How could she have been lying if her actions brought the truth to light? After months of work, the charge was finally overturned. The court acknowledged that Taylor had been wrongfully accused and that the original investigation had been mishandled. For Taylor, this was a moment of relief. It was a step toward healing and a chance to reclaim her story. Overturning the charge didn't erase the pain of what she had been through, but it was an important acknowledgement of the mistakes that had been made. This reversal was more than just a personal victory for Taylor. It was a message to the system that it needed to do better. It highlighted the importance of listening to survivors and taking their stories seriously from the very beginning. It showed how devastating the consequences can be when authorities fail to act with care and responsibility. Taylor's case became an example of why systemic change is so urgently needed. The decision to overturn the charge also had broader implications for other survivors. It sparked conversations about how often survivors are dismissed or doubted when they come forward. It showed the world the dangers of assuming that a child's voice is less credible than an adult's. Taylor's fight to clear her name reminded people of the importance of believing survivors, especially when they are young and vulnerable. In the end, the reversal of the charge against Taylor was not just a victory for her. It was a victory for every survivor who has ever been doubted, dismissed, or criminalized for telling the truth. It was a reminder that change is possible and that courage, no matter how young or small it may seem, can make all the difference. After the trial and conviction of her abuser, Taylor Cadle's life entered a new chapter. The courtroom battles were over and justice had been served, but for Taylor, the process of healing was just beginning. She had spent years fighting to be believed, gathering evidence, and reliving her trauma in court. Now, for the first time, she was faced with the challenge of figuring out how to move forward. Healing after such a long and painful journey was not easy. Taylor carried with her the emotional scars of everything she had endured. The abuse, the disbelief, and the courtroom battles had left their mark. She struggled with feelings of mistrust, wondering how she could open up to anyone again after so many people had doubted her. The weight of her experiences often felt overwhelming, but Taylor was determined to rebuild her life. One of the first steps in Taylor's healing process was finding support. She began working with counselors who specialize in trauma. people who could help her unpack the pain she had carried for so long. Therapy became a safe space for Taylor, a place where she could talk about her feelings without fear of being dismissed. Her counselors helped her understand that the abuse was not her fault, that the system's failure to protect her was not her burden to bear, and that her courage was something to be proud of. Reconnecting with herself was another important part of Taylor's healing. For so long, she had been defined by what had happened to her. She had been seen as a victim, a survivor, a girl who had fought for justice. But Taylor wanted to rediscover who she was beyond her story. She began to explore hobbies and interests that brought her joy, things that reminded her she was more than her past. Whether it was art, reading, or spending time outdoors, these small moments helped her start to feel whole again. Taylor also found strength in helping others. She knew how isolating it could feel to go through what she had endured, and she wanted to make sure other survivors didn't feel the same way. She began sharing her story with advocacy groups, speaking out about the importance of believing survivors and supporting them through their healing journeys. Taylor's words inspired others to come forward with their own stories, giving them the courage to speak out and seek justice. Her bravery became a source of hope for people who had felt silenced for years. Her case also sparked broader conversations about how survivors are treated. Taylor's story highlighted the failures of the system, from the initial dismissal of her claims to the way she was criminalized for speaking out. Advocacy groups and policymakers began using her case as an example of why change was needed. They pushed for better training for law enforcement and social workers, ensuring they would take reports of abuse more seriously. They also advocated for creating safer environments for children to report abuse without fear of being doubted or punished. Taylor's courage also brought attention to the importance of supporting survivors, not just during the legal process, but afterward as well. Her story showed how crucial it is to provide counseling, resources, and community support to those who have been through trauma. It was a reminder that justice doesn't end with a conviction. Healing is a long journey, and survivors need ongoing care to rebuild their lives. In addition to raising awareness about the failures of the system, Taylor's case challenged society to reflect on how it views survivors. It forced people to confront their biases, especially when it came to believing children. Too often, survivors are met with skepticism, as if their stories need to be proven before they can be taken seriously. Taylor's bravery reminded everyone that the first response to a survivor's story should always be to listen, to believe, and to offer support. Over time, Taylor began to see the impact of her fight. Her story reached people far beyond her own community, inspiring changes in how abuse cases were handled and giving hope to survivors around the world. She received messages from people who had been moved by her courage, people who said her story had given them the strength to come forward with their own truths. For Taylor, knowing that her fight had made a difference was one of the most rewarding parts of her journey. But healing was not a straight path. There were days when the memories of what she had been through resurfaced, bringing with them feelings of sadness, anger, and fear. Taylor learned to face these emotions head-on, using the tools she had gained in therapy to process them. She reminded herself of how far she had come, of the strength it took to stand up to her abuser and make her voice heard. Each time she overcame these moments, she grew stronger and more confident in her ability to move forward. Today, Taylor continues to advocate for survivors, sharing her story and working to create a world where no child has to face what she went through. Her journey is a testament to the power of courage and the importance of believing survivors. Taylor's strength reminds us all that change is possible, and that every voice deserves to be heard,